Dr. Anna Ohanyan, Richard D. Finnegan, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Dr. Ohanyan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it has been such a joy to be part of this community, even though I've been here only for literally a few hours, not about 24 hours. I've been so impressed by the work that is being done here, your normative commitment to peace. With this, and I do wish, obviously, that the circumstances are different. And what I would like to do, first I have to figure out how this works. I messed up already. Okay. So what I would like to do within the time that I have, these are the points that I'll try to get to. Most likely, I'm not going to be able to get to, and we'll cover whatever is left in the Q&A. But basically, to talk about the general global and regional implications from this invasion. Specifically, I will focus on the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which is very different from the preceding years of the conflict that was building largely under the radar of the international law. So we'll try to argue as to why this particular invasion is such a turning point, not only in the trajectory of this particular conflict, but also for the world security in general. I will also try to get to some of the existing primary and secondary drivers that exist as explanations within the literature of Russian foreign policy. If there is time, I will also touch on the imperial dimension of this conflict, which is actually quite, for myself actually, up until this invasion, I did not see this as an imperial conflict until President Putin finally, with his speech on February 24th, announcing the invasion, basically said point blank that this is an imperial war, and if you're Kazakhstan, you should be worried. Any other post-Soviet state that is actually, according to Putin, has been created out of the territories of the Russian Empire should be on the mark. That essentially was the aspirational component following from his speech. And what are the implications of ordering and disordering of the Eurasian continent? Before I get to all of these points, let me actually start by sharing something happened at home when the Russian invasion was happening. One of my teenagers, who is high school, seeing this support of Ukraine, it was covered so much, so extensively. There were signs everywhere in our town. In Massachusetts, I live in Concord, and she was actually frustrated and surprised. How come there is such support for the war in Ukraine, but there's not enough when the war in Yemen has been going on for so long? There was no such outcry. To which, on the one hand, yes, per year there are about 50 conflicts around the world, some more violent than others, human cost obviously significant in all cases. But what I try to tell her as to why this particular war is significant in terms of the implications that it is going to have on world security moving forward. And I apologize, I get carried away with the PowerPoint slide design, which did not allow me to expand the font size. So if you do not see the content, don't worry, you're not missing much. The slides are more to guide my talk than for you to see as to what's on the slides. So first of all, key components. This is a war of conquest. I mean, you might say that this is really obvious, but actually in reality, wars of conquest have nearly disappeared. Norms against conquest have been strengthening throughout the 20th century. And it's that norm against, the norms prohibiting changes of boundaries by force. It is that norm that has provided the relative stability in the world throughout the 20th century, not obviously factoring in World War I and World War II. So what we see, this particular war is significant because it is a blatant war of conquest, and in that respect, it was actually surprising to me, many scholars as well, that Russia opted for this approach, particularly concerning that prior to that, the Kremlin was specifically trying to stay out of this explicit invasion scenario and was operating under the radar of international law, building, whether we're looking at the annexation in Crimea, which was quasi-legal, carried out through a referendum, or whether we're looking at Russia's support of deniable support of the conflict that Russia built in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. So I can't even actually, forgetting that I'm aging. The deepening of the existing regional fracture in Eastern Europe. The significance of this war is that now, since moving forward, regardless how the exit from this conflict will take place, now we have a militarized cleavage in Eastern Europe. This is a continent that was considered sort of that has succeeded and kind of tamed the demons of the war, with obviously the war in the Balkan Wars were shattering this image as well. But overall, European Union, European model of expansion, of interdependence was viewed as a regional resiliency. But of course, I actually, before this war, have argued that Europe, NATO, Euro-Atlantic engagement did make countries like Ukraine and Georgia interested in ducks by creating a moral hazard for them, saying you are not part of this, you're not part of NATO, but at the same time, you're not in, you're out, but you're kind of somewhere in between. And that really elevated, created the risk for them, security risk in inviting the Russian attack. And in terms of the militarization of borders for the foreseeable future, the rupture of social and economic connectivity between Ukraine and Russia, there was deep societal connectivity across the region. And I think after this, also when you look back to the Russian Empire, even then Russia, Ukraine, with all the nationalist rhetoric coming from Russia and periods of Russification that the Russian Empire has gone through in various of its peripheries before the rise of the Soviet Union. And so there's quite deep connectivity. So this conflict, what my research finds is that should not have happened, meaning that it was imposed, meaning geopolitical factors were really significant in bringing this about. Global economic instability that will result from this because of the norms of wars of conquest have been weakened. And we see while the United States has been, if you recall, the invasion of Saddam Hussein to Kuwait, which was also a war of conquest, there was significant pushback by the United States and the coalition that it put together. This did not happen in the case of Ukraine, the main reason being that this is Russia. It's not Saddam Hussein. Russia is a nuclear power. And while the West provided significant military support to Ukraine, but there are no Western troops on the ground. So this, meaning that this really lowered the guardrail, the possibility for other smaller dictators, smaller autocrats, carrying out similar attacks in other regions. So in that respect, this really does create the possibility for similar wars of invasion. Right now, as we speak, similar scenarios being attempted to be carried out by Azerbaijan on Armenia's border, but there is pretty significant Western pushback on this. So these are really very difficult times. Interestingly, this was actually mind-boggling for me and many other scholars, that with this war, Putin really accelerated the slow decline of inside Russia as well as Russia's role in the Eurasian continent. Up until this war, I did think that Russia, working with China, would be able to actually carry out and advance this multipolar world order that Putin talks about, even though he envisions it as these regional blocks with few regional hegemons, essentially controlling spheres of influence. Countries like Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan would have to follow the lead of this hegemonic regionalist project, but still, I thought that could be something that would allow smaller states to grow within these types of blocks. But with this particular war, Russia actually also surprised China, I would argue, and became a liability. While China did benefit in a short term from the increased bargaining power it has relative to Russia in terms of access to resources, et cetera, but at the same time, weakened Russia is losing grip over its post-Soviet peripheries, and China is using the post-Soviet peripheries to connect to Europe in a much more effective way. So any hopes of Russia building this new alternative order are quite unrealistic, I would argue. In Russia, one of the arguments that I'll try to get to is as to how fascinating it is that Russia always has tried to do order building from top down, whether it's the Soviet Union, right, the Cold War, and kind of trying to order in large, somewhat coercively, mixture of coercion and engagement. But at the end of the day, I think this top-down, it is the fabric of the Russian foreign policy has been, and I'm probably generalizing and being very ahistorical, this temptation of ordering from top down has been really, really significant. So let me move forward. I have only 5 minutes left. Essentially, what you see in this slide is the very long period of legal doctrines that supported the prohibition of war of conquest, dating back all the way to after World War I, where essentially non-recognition of territorial acquisition by force emerged as a tool to sanction against it. So in that respect, I think as we think about exits, the impossibility of recognizing Russia's annexed territories, and Ukraine is signaling that it is going to try to capture all of the territory, even though Ukrainian public seems to be split as to whether Ukraine should acquiesce and take some territory and stop the war. Communities closer to the borderline are a lot more willing to compromise than the Western communities for obvious reasons. In terms of, let me just conclude simply by saying that there have been within the academic scholarship, up until the war, which again, this Russian invasion is really clarifying as to where Russia is headed. But up until that war, some scholars have argued that Russia is a defensive power, that it's the United States, that it's the West that was like Russia, whether it was the NATO expansion, creating fears of insecurity by Russia. That has been one argument, and essentially saying that there was no post-Cold War settlement of Europe, accommodating Russia in Europe. The second argument argues that actually, on the contrary, Russia is a revanchist power, that it is trying to challenge and undo the existing order, the liberal rules-based world order, no matter how weakened. And with this particular war, I'm inclined to think that Russia at least moved in that direction if it was not that kind of power before. And then the third narrative has to do domestically, that Russia is an isolationist power, that this particular largely irrational decision was a result of increasing domestic authoritarian decay. As such, external power is external wars of adventurers essentially are used to justify regime stability, that this is a war of diversionary war. And I will just simply conclude by citing a great historian, Stephen Kotkin from Princeton University, who has a really great article in Foreign Affairs titled 2016, titled Russia's Perpetual Geopolitics. Arguing predating Putin throughout its history, Russia always resisted modernization from inside and compensating for the lack of modernization by engaging externally into all kinds of different types of warfare, and then really buying domestic legitimacy that way. I will stop here, but I look forward to any questions that might come from here. Thank you.
Thank you.